everyone. Welcome to those who haven't joined us yet before on presentations, and also welcome to those who are rejoining us. Always good to see you and have you here with us as we go through this series of Affordable Housing 101 trainings that we're doing in partnership with Nevada Housing Coalition. I'm Robin Wolf. I'm the Director of Rural Housing for Enterprise Community Partners, and I'm joined here today by my colleague ElevateNV, who is Program Director for the Tribal Nations and Rural team. So glad to be here. Today we're doing Managing Design and Construction, so really focusing on the design and construction phases, and then we even also touch a bit on what we call stewardship, overall property management and compliance that is the ongoing work of what we do as we manage, own, and operate affordable housing developments. Next slide. So like I said a bit, the purpose of this meeting is to really talk through how we go from what is a concept, thinking through the concept in terms of design, and how we actually get to the brick and mortar realization of that concept, everything inclusive of thinking about selecting a GC, how managing the financials of construction, and at the front end, everything inclusive of site selection and aesthetic choices as well. Next slide. So like I said, Evelyn and I work for Enterprise Community Partners. Enterprise is an organization whose vision is to have a country where home and community are stepping stones to more. And our mission is to make home and community places of pride, power, and belonging, and platform for resilience and upward mobility for all. We do that in 3 ways. We work to increase the housing supply around the country. Our team focuses primarily on rural communities, but around the country and through advocacy, through education and training, and also through our capital side, which we'll get into. We also have a pillar to advance racial equity. So we think about racial equity as we go about our work and consider what the work that we do in affordable housing, what impact that has on racial equity, and work to help to right some of the wrongs that have happened, such as redlining in affordable housing and housing in general in the past as part of our work. And we also work to build resilience and upward mobility, thinking about opportunities like home ownership, ways to build assets, credit building and credit repair. All of those are part of the work that we do. Next slide. So as I hinted at, there's 3 different groups within Enterprise Community Partners. Evelyn and I work in solutions. So that's programs, policy, and capacity building. Our work is really involved around advocacy, training, education, and one-on-one technical assistance. We also have a community development group that actually has sticks and bricks development, property management, and resident services, and owns and operates a large portfolio in the Mid-Atlantic region of the United States. And then we have capital, inclusive of tax credit syndication. So Enterprise is a large tax credit syndicator. Also debt from Enterprise Community Loan Fund, and equity and asset management. And on our team, Tribal Nations and Rural Communities, we work specifically with HUD Section 4 capacity building grants. So we have 32 current rural and native grants this year that are released. We'd be looking for that application to come out in the spring. If you're interested in learning more about that opportunity, there'll be some training sessions on that, and that application will come out in the spring of 2023. We also provide training and capacity building training like we're doing right now in partnership with Nevada Housing Coalition, but also training that we do one-on-one technical assistance provision on USDA 515 preservation, and also through with the state of California on Home Key, which is one of their programs. As I said before, we advocate for programs that support affordable housing across the country, and that's that. Covered training already. And with that, it's time to pass it on to Evelyn.
Thank you so much, Robin. Really appreciate it. I wanted to start this off with a brief land acknowledgement for the state of Nevada, which was originally home to the Great Basin tribes of the Washoe, Northern Paiute, Southern Paiute, and Western Shoshone groups. They stewarded the land that you are all calling in from for a really long time. And I also want to bridge this into recognizing that there are 20 recognized tribes in 27 different tribal land areas in the state of Nevada today, 17 of which receive the Indian Housing Block Grant and are thus an essential component of the affordable housing market in their communities and in the state of Nevada. I come from the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa Indians, and our day-to-day work involves outreach to these tribes. So if you happen to be calling from one of these groups, please give us a ring or an email, and we'd be happy to walk you through some additional technical assistance that we have available. So today's agenda, we're kind of in this intro right now. We want to be able to cover site selection and approval to build within a few minutes here, and then move into design for affordable housing. If you have to drop off the call, that's what you're going to get in the first hour. If you have another colleague who's interested in joining at 11, that's when our construction segment is going to start. And then we'll move into stewardship, which we define as property management and compliance, before closing out at 12. So it's going to be a full 2 hours, and we're really excited to have you with us for that 2 hours. We're going to take questions throughout the presentation, really. So feel free to drop them in the chat, and my other panelists on the line, if I'm speeding through any questions, just flag me. And this slide covers a bit of what Joanna covered at the beginning. We're really grateful to be working with the Nevada Housing Coalition on this training series, and we do have the upcoming in-person sessions. And so hopefully there'll be a link to figure out how to register for those in the chat as well. We're also going to do some data gathering towards publishing a Nevada Housing Developers Guide sometime in 2023. And so we want to be able to make that as informed by all of your needs and challenges and desires to make affordable housing more accessible. And with that, we have a little who is in the room. Thank you to everyone who in the chat has so far introduced themselves and their organization and where they're from geographically. And I'm going to go ahead and launch this poll. So this should come up on your screen. I'm going to check the chat to make sure there's nothing I'm overly missing. Looks okay. Yeah, so this is up on the screen. You can either join at slido.com using that code, or you can scan the QR code that's available. You should be able to scan it with your phone. So there's really multiple ways to access. And go ahead and start submitting. The question that I have is, what do you feel is the #1 challenge associated with getting a brick and mortar project on the ground? So what do you feel is the #1 challenge associated with getting a brick and mortar project on the ground? Labor, timing, funding. Gotcha. Thank you. These answers are coming in already. Government. All right. I want to know more about that. What about working with the government is challenging, and during which stage is challenging? Lots of people are putting in funding. We have about 8 responses so far. So I'd love to see that get up to maybe set a goal of 12, and then I'll close out the poll. But if you are typing, feel free to keep typing. Interest rates just came up. That is a huge thing in the market today. A year ago, there was really insanely high costs of existing housing, and now they're lower, but the interest rates are much higher, even if you're working with an affordable or government lender. Assembling sustainable expertise, entitlements, and the building permit process. Yes. All right, we're going to be talking about all of that today. So thank you so much for your responses. And here we go. Surprise. What do you feel is the #2 challenge associated with getting a brick and mortar project on the ground? I want you guys to think through. You submitted your first answer. What is the second most challenging thing? because we really do want to dive into being able to address your concerns in the developer's guide next year. This training is focused on design and construction. So we're looking at kind of like a post-funding phase, or the tricky period where you're moving from pre-development into actually breaking ground. The premise for today's webinar is that you sort of have a number of funding sources and your capital lined up. And now you're wondering what to do next. So we got some numbers coming in, or some discussion coming in. Land availability and cost. Yes, land availability is going to be really key. We're going to talk a little bit about selecting some of our sites. Labor and finding good help. Yes, Robin's going to cover partnering with a good GC. Construction timelines and contractors are always tricky. Bureaucracy is always tricky. Yeah, the affordable and government requirements for labor, that's going to affect your pro forma, isn't it? If you have to do Davis-Bacon Act. And we've got a few more people typing. I think a lot of people are saying construction timelines with contractors, land availability and cost, and permitting as well, of course. That came up last time. Let me give it one more second here. Thanks so much for this early engagement. All right. Okay, so before we begin, I have a brief review. So I don't know how many of you on the call were able to attend either our first in-person training or our previous webinar that was focused on affordable funding and financing. But our kind of layout, the way that we like to train on our team about the different phases of development are up on the screen right now. So we call them phases of development because it's important to break down thematically what's happening, and we can roughly fit it into a timeline. But the huge caveat here is that affordable housing and development is always circular. You're always going to, have to go back to your vision and your mission. You might get through construction and have to rethink some of your funding opportunities. Your design might have to be a part of your planning. Like, these are going to be mixed up into a lot of different phases, but we do want to kind of share this as an overview of how we like to break up our training. And hopefully it's helpful to kind of think about those in your personal checklist and with your teams. The other thing to review is housing development models. So from the pre-development phase, picking these different 4 categories is going to be really key as to like what you want to be able to access for design and construction, including the tenure. So that is asking whether it's for sale or rental, if it's a lease to own homeownership model, or if it's co-housing or another innovative form of tenure. The existing site use matters a lot, right? Are we talking about new construction? Are we talking about either rehabilitating or redeveloping a building? Adaptive reuse is a term for, maybe it used to be an old school building or like an armory or something like that, and now it's going to become more affordable housing. Accessory dwelling units are a way of increasing the density of development without really needing to get a totally new piece of land. So the structure type, what we'll talk about a lot is single family versus multifamily. Multifamily is one building, multiple families living in it. So oftentimes that looks like apartments. Sometimes that looks like condos or fourplexes, things like that. And then also the use refers to whether this entire building, is it just apartments and nothing else? Or is it going to be mixed use buildings? Like might be a commercial space on the bottom. There might be a shop, a store, or another use for the building. So think about these things first and have these kinds of questions answered, and then we'll get to breaking the rest of it out. So this is kind of our first Q&A checkpoint. I promised we'd have them along the way. And I think that we don't have any in the chat right now, but you can always feel free to ask them. Site selection and approval. So this is kind of this came up in the question that I just asked right now. What is the most biggest challenge? It might be just getting approval and permitting. So this is my approval to build slide, and I have a few different pieces of vocab on here that I'm going to go through, but the bottom line is that regulations are always in flux. You're always going to have to check the most up-to-date regulations and permits and processes to be in place. I will say, do not hesitate to work with your local municipality. It is their job to answer questions, and it is often also their job to provide assistance. So the earlier on you can involve them in the process and in what you're thinking of, the more clear it's going to be, and the more time that it's going to save everyone on both of your teams. They're really the people that can answer this. I am not a regulator of any kind. So first thing to consider is zoning, which once you have zoning or an entitlement from a Nevada municipality, that means you're in agreement to build on what the legal rights of what you can do on that property are. So that can be for new construction, or it can be an existing build. So you already have a structure that you're rehabilitating. You have to make sure that it's zoned properly for your converted new use. You're also going to need to go through a request to build. So for new construction, there are many agencies that are involved. So like you're going to go to the Nevada Housing Division. You're also going to go to your local government for zoning, but you might also need to, health is a huge part of housing. The environmental impact is a huge part of housing. So you might be involved with the Department of Transportation, the Department of Health, Fish and Wildlife, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Many people are involved in the request to build, and it's going to be project to project. For the Nevada Housing Division, permits and inspections, I was able to find the first step, they have a document checklist online. I can try to put the link in the chat. Then you're going to go to a permit application process. Once you have your building permit use laid out, and once you're ready for that step, and then the Nevada Housing Division is going to go through an inspection process. So that is a more clear element. The other thing, this is a little bit of something we covered in pre-development, but as we transition into construction, getting a market study that's specific to how many units and how many people and at what rent level can this building afford is going to be really key. So I have a link at the bottom of this slideshow to get more content on what a market study typically contains, but all of this is going to lead to estimates in terms of the cost of your project and in terms of what the market can support for affordability reasons. So that's really going to kind of go back to the slide that I had up earlier with the tenure boxes and the building use boxes. A market study is going to help you make those decisions. So I just wanted to not forget to include that. And then suitability to build. So here's the question. You have your plot of land. Is it suitable for new construction? And what site factors on the plot of land that you have are going to affect your project development? So slope is important to consider. Anything with a grade of 10% or higher, typically they say that this is going to require a large amount of earthwork in order for it to be suitable to build. So if you have the option to select your site, you're going to want to look for a site without that grade. You also want to think through the parcel size and how it connects to the surrounding buildings. Same with soil, drainage and ecological factors are going to be really key here. You want your building to be on a solid foundation. Environmental risks don't just mean like how your building impacts the environment, but also how the existing environment on the site that you selected is going to impact the health and safety of your residents. So water pollution, ambient air pollution, and contamination, like brownfield sites, are going to be required at this stage. You also want to think through the cultural or historic significance of your site. So, and this is something that could be a benefit or a contributing factor to how you design your project. There's a state register of historic places that you can look up, And so, maybe that's something that there's rehabilitation tax credits available. That can be a huge boost to the amount of equity you bring into your project. I'll also mention, considering local indigenous tribes, any tribal land disputes, any tribal presence in the area you want to be really thoughtful of and make sure that you have the right partners on board. And then we'll talk a little bit later about folding the cultural and historical significance of your building into your design. And then, of course, zoning and making sure that you have your zoning lined up. Yes. So I'm seeing a comment from Hillary. I want to clarify that the Nevada Housing Division does not oversee permits or building inspections. Each local jurisdiction oversees permits, fees, and building inspections for development in their locale and has a different process and timelines. Thank you for mentioning that. I think that the way that it was laid out on the slide was a little bit confusing. I think for state land, or if you're working with certain levels of like state projects, that's when NHD becomes involved. But I think always start with your local jurisdiction, like I said on the original slide.
Yeah, the state does compliance, and then we'll get into that, but not permitting, right?
Yeah. So. Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so along with site selection and getting everything in place, you're going to want to think about infrastructure. I like this little graphic here. It's a single family graphic, but it does lay out a lot of the needs that you're going to want to make sure are in place when you're building a brick and mortar building. Sanitation, electricity, telecommunications, that's broadband, making sure there's road access. And that's, again, why the Department of Transportation sometimes gets involved in this, often gets involved in this. Water in the little picture is a well. Often if you're in an urban development, it's going to look different. And some kind of heat. And then with this part of the process, you do want to be thoughtful about ways to lower infrastructure costs. So one recommendation might be phased development. So if you are able to plan for infrastructure improvements to an entire site, even if your project is only built on a portion of the site, that ultimately allows you to build more homes over time. It also allows you to efficiently outreach to all of the agencies that you need to at once in order to get that in place, and therefore lowers the long-term costs of time. And you can kind of get all of your studies and navigate all of your regulatory requirements at once in terms of laying out the infrastructure for an entire development. Say you have a new piece of land, but then phasing the funding for the actual housing to start to go up in just one portion of that neighborhood in that example. Another efficiency is creating denser development. So this includes for public infrastructure use and services. And the data is that it saves 38% on the delivery of upfront infrastructure and 10% on the cost of delivering services. So it does not necessarily mean you have to do multifamily development. It can be just single family homes that are in closer proximity to each other. I just moved out here to Denver. I see this type of development all the time. They are single family homes, but they do have, kind of smaller yards, and then the neighborhood is structured with like more public space and parks in between neighborhood streets. So that's an option to consider. And especially with affordable housing, it's going to be really key because the costs that you're saving are going to go directly towards benefiting tenants on how much they're able to pay. Also, partnerships with public agencies, they can help lower infrastructure costs because they're going to have different strategies in place and help you to cost share and to use multiple financing sources. With that, I also have at the bottom here, I found, if your community is applying for infrastructure funding to address the risks from natural disasters, so like wildfires, droughts, extreme heat, or flooding, there's a program opening on that right now, and there's a link to that on the slide. Building green. Building green is also really key. So this is also called green infrastructure or low impact design. And this is a way of designing your building to mimic natural systems that kind of increase the functionality of the rest of your infrastructure. So your pipes, your wastewater, and your treatment facilities. And this can be used to manage stormwater runoff, sewer overflows, mitigate natural hazards, and revitalize contaminated brownfield sites. So this is, again, a way that when we're talking about green or environmental, it's not just talking about a building's impact on the environment, but also ways to utilize the environment around you to impact the lives of your tenants and the efficiency and cost effectiveness of your entire program. As in the diagram, it kind of shows a few examples of the ways that structuring your house, maybe to be south facing, to have different access to solar panels, natural heating and conversion using the angle of the sun can actually lower your utilities costs. This is a way to improve water, air quality, and resilience to climate change, and as well as lowering infrastructure costs, both for you and your tenants. And it happens to be the case that the Nevada Qualified Action Plan, so if you're interested in submitting a low-income housing tax credit at the state level, they do award points for a certification that our company does, the Enterprise Green Communities for Low-Income Multifamily Projects. It's a certification program created to encourage the slide that I just showed. And on the screen, I have a list of resources. If you're applying for tax credits and you are interested in receiving points for this certification, you can reach out to the certification at enterprisecommunity.org for additional TA that our team has available. And then if you have any questions about policy and advocacy for how that's structured at the state level, I have that person's contact on the screen as well. And if you need a TA provider who's going to be able to go more in depth than what our team can provide, we have that as well. So I think it is a QAP checkpoint next.
I just wanted to talk and kind of revisit that conversation about permitting at the state level. And I think what Evelyn was getting at was the need for environmental review and the need for that to go through, and like there's a HUD involvement in the environmental review, often a phase 1 or phase 2, depending upon, there's a lot of ways for thinking about that. It also needs to be reviewed by the state SHPO, which is the housing historical preservation work, and then THPO, which is a tribal. So those are things that are really key on site selection that I think is what we're trying to get at in that earlier slide, and just wanted to make sure that that is something that folks are aware of. Not permits per se, but permission and understanding and assessment of the land in regards to those environmental, historical, and then tribal impacts are all going to be important as we develop, particularly as we develop with federal funds.
Yeah, and it's tricky because we're kind of looking at it from, we just want to get our project on the ground. Maybe this has already been happening for 2 or 3 years. You've been having these discussions, but all of these regulations were put in place for a reason. And a lot of those reasons were actually to protect the longevity of your project and make sure, you know, that there's a suitable foundation, or that there's not going to be something that happens down the line that's going to jeopardize the asset that you put all this time into.
Very good point, Evelyn. So there's like flood planning review and all sort of that kind of thing as well. And I do see a question about, is there a good resource that you can recommend to help with understanding affordable housing tax credits? We did do a financing session last month that should be available, I think, for you to see on demand as well. And then and that's a basic, you know, as all these trainings are basic trainings. I would also say Novogradac has some good trainings, and they also have a YouTube video that is a really nice kind of, it's sort of cartoony, but a good overview as well. So Joanna's linking the YouTube to the training that we did on affordable housing finance last month as well. It's like in the chat.
And then I think we also have links to share on accessing recent recent training. So if there aren't any other questions, we have some more content on design to cover. So before I begin, I'm not an architect by training. I did work with the Citizens Institute for Rural Design, and so worked alongside many architects and designers for that project, but am drawing from others' knowledge for the content of this slide. And just to start off with some principles of design, there's basically two approaches. You can do a design, bid, build approach or a design build. Really, in order to be cost efficient, a lot of times if you're working in an urban setting or with a larger number of total units, you're going to do a design, bid, build process. But if you have a little bit more flexibility, and if you have particularly under like 50 units or so, a design build is possible. So that's when your design and your architecture team are working to carry you through into the contractor phase. And so Robin's going to talk about that a little bit more, versus if there's an architectural design, you wrap that contract up, you're like, thank you for the architectural design. And then you take that design and you go out and bid to contractors. But no matter how you're doing with it, hopefully you're designing with your community in mind. You're designing for green building, sustainability, and health, as well as disaster resilience, and for people of all abilities. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in the next two slides. But I reached out to, at Enterprise, Ray Demers, heads our design division, and what he wanted to remind you all was that design and housing in general is really cyclical. So you are going to have to go back. This is going to be part of your planning phase. You're going to, be turning this into a brick-and-mortar project here, kind of where we are in the timeline, but also it's going to evolve when it goes into construction. But it's really, let me see if it's on the next slide. Yeah, a good client means better design. So this is kind of, this resource and what I'm about to kind of tell you is like an overview that I hope persuades you to be more informed and be really engaged in the design and the architecture process, because ultimately you as a developer and the project as a whole are going to benefit from you being able to ask really key questions at different points in the design. It might save you time and money because you're going to get to the right decision sooner, and instead of having to go back and forth with different explanations. It allows you to confidently advocate to include the design principles to your funders when there's a square footage trade-off or another cost trade-off. And when a design is no longer feasible, you can respond with more agility if you have all these tools. So just to talk a little bit about design, it can include the site itself, as well as circulation to the site with the connecting roadways. Massing, how does the building look on the horizon of the city or the place that you're in? Landscape is an element of design, as well as what the individual tenants' units look like, as well as how programs and services are delivered and in what room and in what physical environment. And then you're going to want to respond also to systems that are in place. There's a solar power example on the slide. That's a important element. Materials, sourcing them locally, or knowing where your materials are sourced from can help save you time and also give your building a sense of place and a sense of culture. We were working on a project in Hawaii where they had their renderings include shipping containers, because shipping containers are used all the time in the Mid-Atlantic, so it's a readily available material. So I'm really excited about this. I love talking about design. And the first kind of principle that I want, this is just to pass on to you, like you to advocate for this with your architect. We all know that natural light in an open floor plan improves outcomes. It's probably what a lot of us want to see in our apartments or our homes. But the pictures I have up on the screen, I really like, because it shows how that this can still look and feel affordable. This can still be a cost-effective intervention to put into place in your building. So you have an example of what this could look in a tenant's bedroom and even in a kitchen. and keeping things open. And, you know, these are not like luxury apartments in downtown Las Vegas. These are very much attainable for affordable housing, and they're cost effective. So this is what natural light can look like on the interior. And then on the exterior of the building, one easy way to help make sure this happens is kind of a U shape, or making sure that you have all sides of the building have access to natural light and are facing outdoors. And you know, this the other thing is this picture I like. It has a lot of access to natural light without feeling like it's like a fishbowl effect, right? You know, there's some luxury apartments where it's like totally glass windows all the way through. And especially if you're working with families who are struggling with trauma or something in their past that you don't know about, they don't really want to feel like looked in on, and they want to feel like they have their privacy. But we still know that natural light improves a lot of our mental health outcomes. This slide, I quickly have a few suggestions about elements of good design to keep in mind, and again, to just advocate for with your architect, depending on your project. But a lot of light wood floors, that adds warmth. It resonates sound, and it adds kind of texture to the place. It makes you want to linger there. It makes you want to be there. If you have an open space, you can do a dropped lighting feature that's going to delineate a seating area and kind of create a room within a room, or a space within a larger room. If you look on the picture that I have to the left of it, you can see kind of like this green paint around the residents' doors. That I think would be a really cool idea to kind of add some individuality to, and sense of self and sense of place. They were also able to add lighting and even like a little shelf under the door I've seen. But you want to make people feel like their individual self is welcome here. I already kind of talked about the windows without causing a fish tank effect. And the picture that I have up on the screen, I really like. It's from the Mason House here in Colorado, designed by Shopworks Architecture. But it kind of shows both the residential side and then some of the open communal space at the bottom. So focusing on open communal space, if you have any property management going on site, so a service desk, an intake desk for tenants, you're going to want to consider maybe some interior facing windows, right? So that there's privacy between your staff and tenants, but also that it's transparent. And these spaces too, when there's like a front desk, it tends to feel kind of corporate or impersonal. So softer lighting and a more open front vestibule are a few things you can ask about to kind of lessen that effect and make it feel more welcoming. And then I also want you to consider what the history of the building or the place or the neighborhood are, and see how you can incorporate that into your design. This is kind of the most exciting part. If you're renovating an old movie theater, what does that look like in terms of bringing in posters and features that allude to that? Is it near a public market? Does it have roots in a particular industry? I grew up in Pittsburgh, and so I've seen some of the buildings nowadays reference the steel history and reference the manufacturing history of Pittsburgh that a lot of people today are still really proud of. So it's all very exciting stuff. Also, this extends not just to the main building and the main purpose, which is affordable housing, but also to a lot of amenities that your property is going to have. The images of kind of an outdoor access, like indoor-outdoor space, but you're going to want to think about design in laundry rooms and mail rooms as well. Actually, the previous image had a cool example of like a screening effect. So this yellow here, you can see how it has kind of spaces in the pattern. So you would easily be able to tell if there's somebody walking or moving out there, but at the same time, it creates kind of a privacy screen. So that kind of divider, if you have a laundry room or a mail room, is a really good balance between privacy and access. Playground and community workspace are also really important. And I have, I think, some more examples in the next slide. Yeah, so you can kind of see that the desk here has a somewhat transparent like little wall with the wood. to create privacy, but also transparency at the same time. And this slide is kind of all about that, the fact that design can also be for homelessness prevention, but for trauma-informed design, right? So you're working with low-income individuals, especially if you're working like below 50% AMI, or if one of your goals is to prevent recidivism, if one of your goals is to prevent drug and alcohol abuse or substance use disorder, you're dealing with people from a lot of different backgrounds. So a few general principles that you're going to want to ask your architect about include a single point of entry, right? So in permanent supportive housing, you're going to want to be able to monitor who's coming in and out of the building, just so that residents are safe. So there's not, you know, thinking of different domestic violence situations, or bringing in people that they knew from their past life that might not be a good influence on the current life. You can have a single person point of entry that's really welcoming and opening, and have your staff available right there as soon as they walk into the building. You're also going to want to consider how to design for programs and services to live and work on site, so that your staff are viewed as welcoming and open, and residents can just kind of access those services. And then also in any kind of co-housing, really, shared common areas are key, and that kind of is a way of promoting social interaction. So the example shows a common outdoor space. You can also have indoor space, especially for the winter, for residents to kind of, you know, play cards together, or cook together, things like that. Yes, and Joanna linked Shopworks has an amazing set of information on trauma-informed design. And that's something that, you know, if you just read through those, and you as the developer, you know, there's so many different things to focus on a project, but if you just come in being prepared to have conversations about design, that's going to do so much better for your project in the end. And that's kind of what this next slide is about. So I'm interested in asking people to go into the chat for this real briefly. I've been doing a lot of talking here, but this comes from the Design Matters toolkit that Enterprise Design Team put out. So I can do a link for that when I get a pause here. But this is kind of a format for thinking through what your priorities are for your design and how to advocate for them. So I'm hoping that people can brainstorm, you know, whether this is something that is coming up with a property that you're working on right now, or something that your organization specializes in. If you could put in the chat maybe one core design intervention that you think can help you achieve your mission. And I'll kind of explain that, but if you think of an answer right now, go ahead. So the example in this screen is that your desired outcome, one of the things your nonprofit wants to do is to decrease childhood obesity. So an example of a design intervention would be the addition of a playground to part of your site. And so then you would move into talking about what assumptions are we making about this playground, and what needs to happen. So the assumption is that children can access this playground, right? So you're going to want to make sure you're targeting families, or that there's going to be families included in your tenants, and that, you know, however there's fencing or privacy laid out in your building, that the children are going to have access to the playground. And if they're not interested in using it, then you're not going to have any impact on decreasing childhood obesity. But if they are, then that's a great design intervention. And then outcomes, you know, where we in design can feel a little bit more nebulous sometimes than some of the other outcomes that we're talking with. So as much as we can possibly measure data in a concrete way so that we can communicate that to our funders, that's all the better. And the data could be in increased exercise time per week, minutes spent on the playground, and those kinds of things. So if anybody has some other examples or interventions that they're interested in, or that they've seen in their work, and you want to give some examples in the chat, that would be awesome. Looks like Robin said a community center. Yeah, and that encourages a greater sense of community. Yeah, where are people going to come together? Where are they going to talk, host different meetings for their clubs or advocacy organizations? Those kinds of things. I know when I was in college, our dorm had a designated dorm room for a grad school peer advisor. So we were able to, if we had any questions about higher education beyond undergrad, we were able to, we had a neighbor who was able to provide that service. Another example, yeah, so increased medical compliance. How would you get tenants more interested in engaging with the medical field? It might be through an on-site clinic with a community health partner. I love that example as well. All right, well, it is something to think on. And if you think of any examples, feel free to put them in the chat. I think I have one other slide. Yes, so the last thing I wanted to talk about with design, and this kind of, bleeds into the construction phase, but being familiar with the term value engineering. So how most people use the term value engineering, I would say, is you have your design bid build process, you have your LIHTC tax credit application process, and then you go towards, you have to start getting this constructed within a year and a half, and all of a sudden construction costs have increased greatly. So you're going to go through a value engineering phase to try to figure out ways to achieve the same outcomes that you promised your funders with higher costs. And by redesigning portions of the building, so maybe cutting down on square footage for community spaces or other things. But I want to take a second to acknowledge that value engineering doesn't necessarily have to, it can be a phrase used at any point in the process for development. So anything that's achieving decreasing costs or that's achieving increasing function is value engineering. And every decision we make with design is going to be a trade-off between those two concepts, right? So typically we think of increasing function as adding more units. Those are going to come with additional costs per square foot. And the goal with value engineering is to find a way to increase function without necessarily changing the costs. So can the mailroom be located in the same room as the front service desk, things like that. That will in turn help limit the gap financing. So different aspects that you can talk about when you're trying to find ways to value engineer would be in your building materials, in your design needs, construction methods. How is that actually going to go through? The functionality, that was my, design and my mailroom and service desk example, and also the lifespan. So that's kind of another trade-off that you have to consider here is sometimes when you're decreasing costs, and we have to do this, it's so important. We know, we've heard from our community, we have to get these residents housed. Sometimes it's possible to cut costs in material or construction methods in a way that might affect the longevity of the building, or when you might need to rehab certain elements of the building, right? So you're going to have a lifespan on your roofs, your flooring, your utilities in each apartment, and maybe in order to get everything closed out, you're going to anticipate that there's going to be rehabilitation costs kind of sooner in your long-term timeline. And so for this part of the process, in addition to the architects, structural engineers, and general contractors that you've already started to involve in your process, there are certified value specialists that are used to kind of bring in and help figure out how to close the gap there. That's and again, this is a one quick 2-hour training. There's no way to cover all of what you need to talk about with design and all the phases of development in these 2 hours. So that was my quick slide on value engineering. But I'm seeing something in the chat. Another design approach is the integrated project delivery method. This involves your design team, contractor, MEPs, framer, and property management firm. I really like that intervention idea. Thank you so much, Anthony. Yeah. So I'll take a second here and see if there are any other questions or just comments. Again, I've been talking a lot.
Yes, please ask questions and comments. I do think IPD could be a really good solution. I do want to note, and we'll talk a bit about this as we get into construction, you have to make sure that the way we procure our contractors is in alliance with the way the federal funding that we might be using is structured. So we have run into problems where somebody who provides a construction estimate, for example, is then precluded is not a word, from providing a bid on construction. So that may or may not be the case. It's just something you want to look into. I know that's the case for USDA rural development funding, for example. So just a note as you're thinking about those methods, it does definitely eliminate and make things like value engineering a lot easier when you have an integrated method. Yeah. No other questions?
Yeah, so thank you guys for your time and your attention. And again, all these slides are going to be sent out, and I'm happy to answer any questions if you think about them or you're too shy to put them in the group chat and you just want to message me. And Robin, I will pass screen sharing over to you.
Okay, let's see how this goes, y'all. Okay, you should be seeing my slides. And fantastic, we are good. So with that, we are in construction. Who knew? And like Evelyn said, this is all, the whole training is assuming that you already have gotten your financing stack and your capital stack together. We talked about that last month, so really encourage you to kind of think through it and revisit that and those conversations, as well as as you continue to work through a process and a project. So we'll start with managing the construction process. Okay, here we go. So we're talking, there's a lot of different ways you can go about construction. Much of this, as I'm talking through in this particular slide, needs to be figured out in design. So again, as we've talked about so many times, it's circular, it's iterative, we put it in phase development like it's linear. It's not really a linear process that much. It's really, it really loops back forward on itself. So things that could be of use or of interest as you're thinking about cost effectiveness, expediency, are modular versus on-site methods for construction, what your method is for recruiting your qualified contractors, design build, or a more integrated model might be a good method. Is there a team that does that? Making sure that works with procurement guidelines, with your funding sources. Phased development, as Evelyn talked a bit about, there's a key amount of infrastructure, particularly as you're working in a community that might have just been annexed into a town or city, and that needs infrastructure, or you need like roads, for example, that is often best done in phase development. So maybe a road that provides access to single family and multifamily. You'll do multifamily. I'm thinking through that with like maybe a low-income housing tax credit, and then multifamily as part of another kind of affordability model or a market rate model even. But that would be phase development, or simply just like a phase 1 and phase 2 of a multifamily project. So maybe you're doing 200 units, or you know your need is for 200 units, but you believe you can gather capital and do a 100 unit project. This year, and then in the next, several years, you might be able to do phase 2. You'll be thinking about that as you're thinking through, especially if you're putting in new infrastructure, about that phase development and creating greater efficiencies there. We've also got the pre-construction kickoff, I'll get to in a later slide, and really make sure you know who your development team is, inclusive of a GC or general contractor, possibly an owner's rep. Talk a bit about that as well, and of course an architect. Those are those are kind of three real key roles that you want to make sure you understand and have on point. So let's talk about selecting a general contractor and what bid look like. So often bids, and the way that, again, some of this has to do with the structure of federal financing, bids are requested using a bid or proposal package. And government speak, often we call that an RFP, or request for proposal. So that package needs to include the details, the timeline inclusive of architectural, structural, mechanical, civil engineering, material specs, interior needs, and landscaping. So that make sure that your GC knows that's what they're responsible for. Description of the site, description of the project, what your process is for selection, what is your length of time for selection, when do you expect to close and start, break ground. All of that should be part of that conversation. Bid terms and conditions. So again, we must go with the lowest bidder, or we can go with the we want to go with the lowest bidder, but if we have enough extenuating circumstances, we can justify it. So these are all things you need to understand, and how to make sure that you're in compliance with your sources as well. Davis-Bacon wage rates. Davis-Bacon wage rates are required for your development. So Davis-Bacon may be required for your development, for using home or CDBG if you have more than 8 units in a contiguous project. Those would be Davis-Bacon is required. There's a few other ways that Davis-Bacon is required. Davis-Bacon is a basically federal minimum wage rate that you would have to meet, that might be something your contractor would be bidding less than. So you need to make sure that's understood. And then also the process of certifying that, who's going to handle that. And then instructions on what to include in a bid proposal response, including any required documentation. So in addition to your spreadsheet with your cost estimates, or however that's put out, what you might want to know how many years they've been doing it. You might ask for references. You should ask for what they have in terms of insurance, and what their binding and licenses are as well. So all of that is part of selecting a general contractor or GC. I think another thing to really just kind of keep in mind here as we're going through this process, and I always say it depends on your sources, but I can't stress enough to make sure you're aware of these things. Some states, some local jurisdictions, if you're going to be using their home or CDBG allocations, will require you to post the availability in a local paper, for example. So make sure you're understanding that, make sure you're thinking through that. You don't want to have selected somebody and then have to go back, or then you're just starting off out of compliance. No, none of us want that. So the process of soliciting bids, or the bid invitation, again, funders requirements. I really talked a little bit about this already. I gave us a preview of the slide, thinking about it. If you have to put it in news outlets and provide other evidence that you've done due diligence to find and select that contractor. The reason this is the case is because, let's say my brother is a contractor and he puts in a bid. It might be the best bid, but we have to make sure that, and with government money, that's justified, and that answer is justified. So you need to see other bids. You need to have let other people, so that you don't just have whoever happens to be your friend or your brother or sister as your contractor, especially as we're especially important, and being careful of that with federal funding. Remember that your project location could very well impact the number of bids you receive. This is kind of sometimes where, when we're in more rural and remote areas, we struggle to show our funders that we got 3 bids in, or as the market is really tight. That could also be an issue. And so So just something to note, what you'll have to do is say, we put this in the paper, we did these things, we only got 2 bids, so this is why we don't have 3, so we're going to take the best out of the 2, and you'll have to write normally some sort of justification if you're using federal funds. And if there's no other bidders demand, then you can think about what you're going to do. Like, you might only have 1 bidder, right? And so how to justify that sole source procurement, meaning 1 provider gave you a bid, so you are doing that with 1 provider going forward. I hope that if you only have 1 bid from a provider, that you got a decent bid, but that's always something, you know, these are the tricky pieces, particularly, like I said, for challenges that we can face as we're looking at rural or more remote areas as well. And just do be aware of what your rules are so that you can do and have the proper documentation at the start. The reason the proper documentation is important is because it will ultimately, it could really create lags on your time. Items beyond price that you want to consider. So this is something you, like I said, you might want to put a brief overview of in that request for proposals or RFP. And just something, if you do have the luxury of having several bids, these are going with the lowest bidder is not always the best idea. And so really thinking through, what are their qualifications and experience? Have they done similar work? Like I said, do they have references, other providers of housing that's similar to what you're trying to build? Do they have proper bonding, insurance, and licenses? Was the RFP complete? That's a good question. Was it on time? That could be a good indication of other things being complete and on time. So something else to note. So again, might be the lowest bid, came in, that was like kind of spotty, what was actually answered, got the right numbers, but like a lot of pieces were missing. You want to think about that and whether or not that is going to be the right contractor to work with going forward. How does that contractor align with your project goals? So there are requirements for Section 3, which has to do with employing folks of lower incomes or women or minorities as part of your contracting or subcontracting team. So it might be that one of your GCs does qualify as a Section 3 business, or does have subs that qualify as a Section 3 business. So something to note. And even if you're not required to meet Section 3 guidelines, it still could also be really important for you to note whether or not, you know, are what they do, what they're for, aligned with your goals. For example, at Enterprise, we have a pillar for racial equity, as we talked about at the top of the presentation. So we do basically do weighting for minority-owned businesses as part of our contracting assessment. And then, is there a process for change orders to best ensure you're comparing the same pricing? This is just the last slide, and it looks pretty innocuous. Change orders are really huge, right? As we're thinking about what your overall costs are going to be, what do they consider a threshold for a change order? Does change orders eat into contingency? Does the contingency not inclusive change orders? Really understanding what they're considering that you're on the same page and they're comparing apples to apples, all really important. So once you've gotten your general contractor on board, and as you're doing some of this work, and you want to make sure you have a construction schedule. So making sure you're thinking about inspection, hiring, and reporting. Inspections are going to be at multiple levels, right? They're going to be inspections. They might be from your funders. They might be like, so your construction lender, maybe your permanent lender, maybe your construction and permanent lender are the same. If you have money, like your funders, again, might have, like, besides your lenders, the funders who are part of your equity financing might have requirements for your inspection. So if you're using tax credits, they might have thresholds for when inspection are. So make sure you're thinking about that, because often folks might have to travel to go do those inspections, and you want to have that communication so that you're not creating a lag as you're thinking through it, as those inspections come up. Hiring, really key as you're thinking about property management when you're hiring. But even like hiring subs, will the subs be available 3 months from now when you have to put flooring in, for example, the folks that you want to do your flooring or that your general contractor does. So making sure that you and your general contractor are on the same page there. And then reporting considerations, all of that, like, again, what needs to be reported, what needs to be approved before you can go forward to another phase. Community capacity for development. Are you trying to source local materials? If so, do you know that like the lumberyard, for example, in your community has enough lumber to source this project? That's something that could really affect your timeline, as we really saw with supply chain a couple years ago, and still have some lagging supply chain issues. So it's always important and great to use local materials. Often that's a way to keep that timing down, and still and very well could be, but just making sure you understand those needs and they understand your needs and the timing of your needs for key items. Lumber, appliances, this comes up on a lot of different things. Do you have a local workforce? Do you have enough people who are providing bids? Particularly, this comes up as we're thinking about also like single family projects, like a self-help or habitat project. Do you have a construction finance, or not construction finance, a construction manager who can can you lift somebody up to be that construction manager to help and stay with that project for maybe several years? And then managing construction finances. What are drawdowns and what are the change orders? So what are drawdowns is not sort of a rhetorical question, but what is the process for drawing the money from your construction loan? That's what I'm getting at in that bullet. How do you have to aggregate? I would recommend aggregating, but what are the thresholds for aggregation? Do you want to aggregate by milestone, or do you want to aggregate by timing? Like, for example, monthly, do you want to aggregate your costs and then get them paid? What is going to be allowable with your construction financing and or your funding sources, depending upon which ones you're using first for which pieces. Also, for example, if you decide to use federal money, but you're using the federal money on infrastructure, maybe that's because it has different implications for Davis-Bacon than using it in a different part of the project. Then making sure you understand when that draw is supposed to be done and that piece gets closed out prior to you're working on the draws for construction loans. And then again, back to what are change orders? What is the process for change orders? Making sure you, your general contractor, whoever you have, it might not be you, right? We all work within organizations, right? Whoever that is representing the organization, the owner, operator, person who's ultimately responsible for a tax credit allocation or the financing of that project or LLC, understands the change order process, the cost of change orders. And so that's key. This is where, like I said, so maybe you don't, maybe you have a smaller staff, right? You're a small public housing authority and you have 5 staff members and you don't have a full-time director or you have a director of like real estate development who can be out on the site all the time as all of these things are happening. They don't have to be out all the time, but they have to be out with frequency. Then that's also the opportunity where you could bring an owner's rep in and bring that person in on a sort of consultancy basis for the lifetime of this project construction that is responsible for advocating for your organization and thinking through the needs of your organization, working with the GC, troubleshooting, communicating back. So that is another opportunity, something you can think through. And then huge, as we do our closings, the end of the day, we have our certificate of occupancy, cannot move. No matter how good your project looks, no matter how finished it feels, If you don't have a certificate of occupancy, you cannot move residents. So making sure your construction schedule ends and doesn't end until that certificate of occupancy is in hand. So the construction schedule is going to be organized around, often going to be organized around key phases or milestones. So pre-construction, permitting, site work, depending upon the site, and as Evelyn talked about, site selection, slope, grade, soil conditions, for example, that might be more intensive than others. Foundation, framing, major installations, that could be like an HVAC, electrical, plumbing, interior finishes, the fixtures and appliances, landscaping, and then final exterior work. All of that can be phases or milestones for your construction schedule. Showing you an example of a construction schedule. This is actually for a healthcare project. So thinking about like what you've got for connections and site work, then you've got concrete. So you've got that scheduled. This is a Gantt chart. So anywhere from April, but it should be done by June. You've got like metal work. This is framed with metal, so that would be framed, might be framing. Moisture protection, if there's anything like that you need. When is that happening? See, it's at the same time as this framing, mechanical, electrical, wood, doors and windows frames. And then specialties and equipment. This is like where your appliances and things like that are going to be. See this little occupancy way over here. That's the deal. So you've got, this is a timeline of February to March. That's, you know, a full, it's actually 1 month longer than a full year. So thinking through all of those pieces and the length of time so that you know what you really have ahead of you in those interim phases. Is there inspection here? So are your inspection teams aware that they need to be out in October? Is there another inspection in December that has to happen? And then a final inspection that allows for your certificate of occupancy, making sure all of those are considered and part of your construction schedule is really important. And so a lot of this is decided at your pre-construction meetings. So your pre-construction meeting is where you think through with your general contractor, your architect, your environmental engineers or consultants to build a shared accountability for the timeline. So through this time, there is no one way to do this. And so it's really important. And also when you create a team of a whole bunch of different teams, it's really important that you have shared expectations at the onset. So thinking through and clarifying roles and responsibilities, defining those payment schedules, creating a chart like that, really thinking through, it's very possible. And a question you can ask of your general contractor, what are their project management processes? What do they do to help you kind of meet these milestones? Really reasonable questions to ask as you're engaging in this work. How can you further think through the processes for project management? Who needs to be informed? Who has authority? Who has authority as, you know, on the owner operator side? Who has authority like from the general contractor? What can they say yes and no to if something comes up? They're like without approval. Making sure that's really, really clear between all parties. What are the procedures for inspection? Who's in charge for ordering this inspection once like a certain, like I said, once framing is done? Who's in charge of ordering the framing inspection? Is it going to be the owner's rep? Is it going to be the general contractor? Is it the architect? Making sure you know all of that and are thinking through all of that at the very beginning before you even break ground. Change order process. Sound like a broken record on the change order process. Clearly, I think it's important. And then also, it is not a bad idea. None of us want to think about delays, but there are going to be delays. And so talking through at the beginning, what you're going to do to manage delays, what your expectations are about delays, and then this is where this is where this permitting and local jurisdiction conversation continues to be relevant as we think about like all these inspections. Asking and making sure that what your expectations are, or when they need to come and give, you know, allow for permits or or sign off on something, that their time frame and what your concept of the time frame is the same and is properly mapped out, or not, Gantt chart or whatever kind of other project management tool, so that you really know what your construction timeline is going to be. I know this is really weedsy. I do think there's real value in kind of talking through some of this, though, and getting in the weeds, because these are things that we don't necessarily consider, and it's a lot easier to think through it now and to hear this and to have this kind of in your head than having to learn some of this as you're dealing with delays and change orders and inspections. So I hope this can serve as a good resource for you, and that some of you don't have to learn some of the lessons, but I've gotten to learn in this respect. Inspections. Local building officials are going to conduct your inspections to confirm that different elements of your project are satisfying building code requirements. This is what we sort of were clarifying at the top of the session, that permitting is, and the building codes, that is going to be handled at the level of your local jurisdiction. What is a local jurisdiction? Well, if you're in, so that's either going to, it's whoever holds the building code requirements. Generally, that's the city you're in. It might be at the county level, particularly if you're in an unincorporated area. So that's where you're going to be looking for there. Whoever their building code enforcement office is, they might be somebody in the planning department that also has to come and make sure that what your building looks like it matches what they have approved in their PUD. So these are all things to think through and to note. Other partners, though, also might require inspection. So as I mentioned before, USDA, the USDA rural development, if you're doing any project funded with their money, may also require inspections at regular intervals. And this can impact your timing. So make sure you understand who's going to be involved. And I would often include some of those folks on your pre-construction, or if, at least ask them questions that come up through your pre-construction meetings, really making sure you understand what their role needs to be during construction, like floor framing, wall framing, roofs, ceilings, chimneys, which structural elements require a physical inspection, what are the turnarounds for physical inspection, who's going to come out, and then what is the post-construction process for getting the comprehensive inspection and your certificate of occupancy. Can't move folks in until you have a certificate of occupancy. Project management. So a lot of this that we're talking about is project management. We have, again, going back to that idea that you as the developer, owner, operator, this is also really key to point. I say developer, owner, operator is all one thing. That's not always the case. You might be the owner operator. You might be the one who's going to steward the project through in the long term, but you might hire another developer and as a turnkey developer. That turnkey developer might come with the general that might be part of the general contract services, but it's a different role, right? And so making sure you understand what your team is and who is the responsibility. If you do have a developer, turnkey developer that might be helping managing the JC, are they acting as the owner's rep? What is the role of the long-term ongoing owner there, and how that's going to work together? This is really important to understand the ins and outs, and that it's understood by everybody at the end of the day, so you don't run into issues mid-project that are going to create a delay, create confusion, and create budget overages. Really key to think through that really clearly, and that rules and expectations, and whose role is project management, or what piece of project management falls on which entity and which member of your team. As you round out the key phase, the project manager is going to be thinking through the walkthrough. I do want to say, I would not have my general contractor be the person who is, you need somebody who's an owner's rep on your team, and that could be part of your development team that's contracted, overseeing and making sure and doing the inspections in conjunction with your GC. So anyway, that was thinking about addressing That way they can hold them accountable for unaddressed items, look through all those pieces, and that's why it needs to be an external to your actual general contractor. At inspections, it's recommended you join the inspector. So often, you know, the city says, oh, we're sending somebody out tomorrow, whatever, great idea. If you can be there tomorrow and at 9:30 or whenever that inspector is going to be out, so that you can hear, talk through, see what they're seeing, and be on the same page. And then this is the same as true for that final inspection and for that certificate of occupancy, so that you can get your folks really ready to move in. So this comes up a lot, and I think is really important and builds on what we talked about as we were talking about the full-on funding of affordable housing developments. What's your difference between construction financing and permanent financing? So your construction loans are going to be shorter term financing. They're really there to cover project costs during your construction phase. As we think about the capital stack and what we've covered, thinking through what your debt is, it could be that you have a construction lender from, you know, one entity that's one entity and a permanent lender that's another entity. Often you'll probably have a construction loan that then converts to a permanent loan, but that's not always. So something to really understand. Your construction loan has a much higher interest rate. There's a lot more risk, and it has a much higher interest rate as a result. This needs to be thought about as you're thinking about costs. This needs to be thought about as you're thinking about timeline, because the longer you have drawn down money on your construction loan, the longer you're paying for most of your project, like all of your projects kind of hard costs at that high construction loan rate. So it's really important to have a good understanding of when this is. It's really important to have a good understanding of timeline, not just because of overages that can come out from change orders or, you know, supply costs, but overages that could be results of the time going longer. This is one of those instances where time truly is money, because having a rate of, you know, 10% interest on the amount that you've drawn versus 5 is drastically different, right? So something to note as well. Then also your construction will be paid at set intervals. So whatever those milestones, and this is also why sometimes you want to make sure you have somebody from your financing team thinking through those pre-construction milestones with you. What are their expectations? Do they want your draws to be monthly? Do they want them to be not until framing, not until you've hit a major milestone, like for example, framing? What are the expectations of your funder? When are they, every time they do a draw, do they need to come out and inspect, or is that not the case? All of those pieces need to be worked out with your construction lender, because some lenders, like I said, require verification of the milestone via inspection, and you don't, you want to know that as you're building out your schedule. Any questions right now? I know I talk a lot, I talk fast, and get really in the weeds real fast. So if you have questions, do not hesitate. You can use the chat feature, you can use the Q&A feature, either feature work. Or like, as we got a couple of folks who have shared insight earlier about different methods or some different thoughts about this, or procurement, or thinking through, please share those with us in the chat as well, because I think that it's really helpful to hear from multiple sources about multiple approaches here. Okay, a little bit more about managing your construction financing. So before your construction begins, you're going to need to close on your construction financing. So you've got 2 closings generally on an affordable housing development. As you're thinking about it, particularly this is thinking through a light tech or low income housing tax credit development. So you close on your, but this is true actually of any project. You're going to close initially for your construction loan. That's going to include, so in order to get there, it should be the first date on that construction schedule. There's a lot of things that have to happen to make sure you're there at that point. Your final review of all the forms and exhibits to ensure the accuracy of the terms. So making sure that your lender, you are all on the same page with everything that's there. If your board needs sign off on these documents, or like depending upon your signatory authority, all of that is taken care of. Confirmation of clear title. So there's going to be a title company involved in this initial closing that's going to help with that. But really look into that ahead of time. You don't want something to come up, you know, that you could have caught earlier and delay closing. So hopefully this is stuff that you thought about, again, earlier on as you're thinking through your site and learning, doing more of your due diligence there. Are there any issues with the title of a property? And are there any other liens in particular? The lender will confirm necessary steps that have to be taken to secure the property and prepare. So the lender is going to go through again, like make sure that what you say your zoning is allowed and what like is truly allowed. Looking through, did you already get your initial building permits? They're going to probably look at your GC and your procurement for your general contractor and look at their licensing and bonding as well. And then also the lender might look into what's your existing utilities and then what's your organization's insurance coverage during this really high risk time of construction. Why is construction high risk? Because you're going to put out a whole bunch of money. They're closing on essentially the full cost of what is needed and equity like to the project. And you're putting it out without having a certificate of occupancy, which means without a revenue source. And so there's a real high risk during this time, at least as far as your lender is concerned. Final copies of the funding agreements and associated documentation are going to be circulated to everybody for their records. So all of your key, so that's going to be in the lender side, that's going to be on your side, any other key partners that might be part of that are part of your legal entity, your LLC or triple LP, however you've got your property organized. And then you're going to pay your initial financing fee at that point too. So there's an initial financing fee. Sometimes there's an extension or deferment, so that financing fee gets wrapped into what you're going to owe at the end and then wrapped into your permanent, but knowing what fees are going to be needed at that initial closing is really key. Okay, one more thing to think about, or just another thing to think about, right, as we're thinking through construction financing, is retainage. Retainage is a portion that you keep back on progress payment until the contracted work is complete. So this could be retainage that you keep all the way till the certificate of occupancy. You could do retainage on a milestone basis as well. This is just something so that you don't get to the end of the day with your contractor and they're like, peace out, and you feel like you don't have your certificate of occupancy. And so like you can be like, well, remember we've retained 15%, and so you can't get paid that. And so that happens often, like 15% of each draw might be retained. There's different ways of looking at that. So thinking about how that's set up, or they're just not allowed to draw on that final percent until the certificate of occupancy is reached. There's a couple of different ways to look at it. Some sources, some lenders will require retainage. Some lenders will require no more than X amount for your retainage. So just know and be thinking through this. And also know that even if you have it, you still need to be really clear with your contractor and your GC how and when the work is going to be done to make sure you're not running into a cash flow issue at any point during that construction phase. So retainage is a key tool that you have as the developer and owner to ensure the timeliness of the project as you want, and ensure that the completeness of the work done as it has been scoped. So just that to note, retainage is not to be confused with contingency. Contingency is money that you're hoping not to spend at all. And it should be built into your budget as well, into your construction budget. At least 10%. We've been kind of talking about doing contingency as high as 20% because our cost overruns were so high. It also depends on what you can fundraise on the other side, so somewhere between 10 and 20%. That's contingency. That's where your change orders are going to come from, and some of these other pieces. That's where your your increased supply costs are going to come from. That's different than retainage. Retainage is an amount to ensure that your contractor, you have some leverage as the project closes out to get things to the level of completeness that you really want. Any questions about that or about any of the other pieces we talked about in both construction as a phase of development and then also construction financing a little bit in particular? Evelyn, do you have a question? Oh, you're on mute.
I guess maybe I'm trying to think of what kind of questions or concerns to anticipate from a GC. Like you gave a few really good tips about how to kind of evaluate them, but I don't know, like what are they going to be asking me as a developer, or what are they going to be concerned with making sure is in their contract?
Yeah, I think, great question. I think what does come up, GCs are really interested in timelines as well, right? Just like as a developer, the owner, you're interested in timelines. The GCs are also interested in the timeline. They don't want to tie up more time on one project because it's still one, again, time is money to them as well. They can't start a new project with new budget. And so I think often as we come into projects, the more like layers of inspection, the more kind of places that can slow down a process can often make your contractor nervous. So the more communication ahead of time that you can have about where those points are and real knowledge you can have about that is really important, not just for you and your construction interest, although I often think from the perspective of the developer, owner, operator, but you're right, Evelyn, also to your general contractor. And they could also get really frustrated if there's an overage in terms of the timeline because they anticipated having, you know, like this is a project for 12 months. They anticipated that much income over the course of 12 months. If it takes 18 months, they still have staff that they have to keep employed. And so it really changes their costs. So really good point. This is not just to, managing these expectations is not just to protect the developer, the owner operator. It's also to really make sure that there's real clear expectations on both ends. And it is really going to be important ultimately also to your general contractor. Your architect as well. A lot of these folks don't get paid fully until you get to final closing. We talked about initial closing, but that final closing doesn't happen until after your certificate of occupancy is achieved. Just one other note, Joanna noted that if you want your line unmuted, I think you can either say it in chat or raise your hand. So if you'd like to ask a question out loud, that can be available to you as well. That said, I think given sort of timing and where we are, if there's no other questions, I'm going to move on and talk about stewardship. So stewardship, Evelyn alluded a little bit as to what we talk about or refer to as stewardship on our team here at Enterprise. It's really what happens. What happens with the project after it's complete and after you achieve the certificate of occupancy. So the ongoing stewardship of that project is us thinking about how we're using it to serve our community. So property management is one of these pieces. Compliance is on part of ongoing stewardship as well. Property management and maintenance together. I don't want to forget maintenance. So we're going to start with an overview of property management and kind of talking about what the key tasks are for a property management from property management company or property manager. And then really overall, what you need to understand about property management in the long term, particularly for an affordable project, but really for a rental project in general. Security and safety of your residents should be very key as you're thinking through responsibilities for property management, maintenance and repairs, budgeting and financials. So what are the responsibilities of the property manager to make sure rent is collected in a timely fashion and that is getting posted in the right way, and to your accounting system in the right time. Staffing, do you have a property manager on site? Do you have somebody who's coming out multiple times a week? What are the staffing needs for that project, and how is that going to be considered? Maintaining and utilizing property management or management information systems. This could be Yardi, for example, if you're for property management. It could be another system for posting rents and work orders. Leasing, marketing, tenant selection, and eviction. So a property manager has a lot of responsibilities, or a property management entity. Those roles include all of that. And eviction is part of that, thinking through. And then what are your eviction policies and procedures? How do you want to get to that space? If you do have to get there, and how it goes through. And then, of course, compliance with your funding. Your property manager in particular, like the person or the outsourced entity, is going to be responsible for collecting rent, developing and maintaining those policies and procedures. So you might, they can develop some of the policies and procedures, but you're going to have to make sure whatever they develop in terms of policies and procedures is in compliance with your funding sources. So, for example, if you have a project with federal money and your property manager decides that after 1 month or 2 months of not paying, they'll be evicted, you need to make sure that's actually in line with, like, what are the state laws about eviction and what are your sources about eviction? So, this all with a grain of salt, right? Ensuring compliance with regulations. So again, that'll happen on behalf of the company, but also needs to happen on behalf of the owner and operator, even if you don't have, like, even if you do have an outsourced or experienced property manager coming in. Property manager is going to be maintaining tenant files and the property records. So any large work orders that were done on the project, the tenant files mean all their income certification, tenant certification, thresholds, research as well, and unit work orders, and then all of those pieces are going to be part of that. Providing routine maintenance and repairs, that's going to be done by your property management team. Sometimes you might have a maintenance person and a property manager who does not do maintenance, but does rent collection and the other more office-based. Sometimes it might be the same person. Sometimes it might, again, be an outsourced agent and they're doing it at multiple sites. Property manager also provides tenant customer service. They are the face, the kind face, hopefully, that where somebody comes to lease out a unit, and also to work through something that might be creating a delay in their rent payment. So customer service is a key role of property management. And also the property manager is really also, especially as we're thinking about affordable housing and layering with resident services, often the key person to coordinate with service providers. You may also have a resident services coordinator, and if you do, that's awesome, and that person will probably be doing that. Marketing and lease up. So marketing and lease up, property management is responsible for that, right? And then, so again, I talk about in-house or external, meaning many groups use an external property manager for their property management. It's not always possible, though, depending upon where you are. Great question. So that's a great question. So this is something to really think about. I will say I have. It's my experience that the more rural you are, the harder it is to find a third-party group that's able to do it for a cost that makes sense to you because they don't have other properties around. In general, property management can be really expensive per unit. So having more units together in a certain area can make the cost lower. So if you're developing one multifamily project, that maybe there's some like scattered site single rentals that you're doing in a community, and using the same property manager could be a good tool to create better ways of cost. Do know that you have to create a marketing and outreach plan for some of your funding sources from the federal level. Some of those require also attentiveness to fair housing. So asking specifically about like how many languages that you've done outreach in and some questions such as that. And then I talked about certificate of occupancy a lot in this training. The CEO certificate of occupancy is key to start moving residents in and getting the project on solid footing. So you need to start working on marketing and lease up prior to getting to the certificate of occupancy. So your property management team or property manager should have been hired mid-ish way through construction to start thinking through this, to enacting some of this, to start creating a wait list and vetting tenants. So when you get that certificate of occupancy, you can get residents in. This is because you have some requirements, particularly if you have low-income housing tax credits, that your lease up needs to happen within 90 days. And that's really hard to do. Remember, folks have to give their notices and things like that from their other units. And so unless they have enough lead time, then you're going to create a greater lag if you have not started this process far before your certificate of occupancy. I'm going to touch, yes, I see a question in the chat about small organizations or new developers that don't have a staff person with a construction background. I think that's really, I think that's very common, actually. And so one of those ways I think that without that you can fill this gap is to look for an owner's rep, right? I referred to a little bit, somebody who basically has a construction background, who's operating on behalf and is serving as a specific consultant to do project management and construction overview on behalf of the owner and operator. So that is one thing. The other option I also alluded to, but didn't kind of really go into in detail, is the prospect of a turnkey developer. So a turnkey developer, turnkey meaning like, here's the keys, you're done. They build it soup to nuts, sort of, and help with a lot of these pieces. That said, there's not always a turnkey developer that's available in your community. There might not be, a lot of them are working on affordable housing. So that is part of what, we're working on as we're thinking through this Elevate Nevada project and how we're thinking through what are ways to build up and to create greater synergies there, so smaller groups can have access and can have that expertise brought in. It doesn't really make sense, right, from an economic standpoint. If you're a small organization and you're not building a LIHTC property or low-income housing tax credit property, or even just any another multifamily or single family, if you're not consistently building, to have somebody in your own staff that is a construction or development specialist is not often cost effective. So this is often going to need to be contracted out. So trying to help match, and part of what we're going to talk about in that in-person session too, and bringing in some experts, trying to help match smaller groups with larger, more experienced groups or other turnkey developers or owners reps that might be able to help them through this process is key. That said, this level of training is to really just kind of understand what all those tasks are that person or that team might be able to do for you. So Hillary, I hope that answered your question a bit. Vince, it looks like you seconded those questions. So continue to ask follow-ups in chat. Happy to kind of talk through those as they continue to come up. So services and tenant selection. So something that is kind of it's a weird slide where I just mashed two things together. But one thing that can really affect your marketing or your marketability and your place in the market is what resident services you have. Do you have childcare available on site? Do you have a housing counselor that can provide financial counseling and financial education? Do you have I think we talked about it at one point in the chat about with design, some more compliance with healthcare visits. Do you have a way for healthcare visits to happen on site or telehealth visits to happen on site? Other wellness programs you might have. I used to have a senior property in our portfolio where I was working, and we had a sit and be fit class that came in, an instructor who came into the community center and taught a class on property. Do you have community empowerment space? I don't know why it says "and" there, but do you have a space that is designed for community engagement, where that class could happen, where you could have potlucks, where you could have tenant meetings? What is your, like, that could be encouraging and getting folks in. And then also, are you on a transit line? Do you have access to a shuttle? Do you have internet access? Hopefully, we're thinking now in this era, as internet is a necessity, as a utility, instead of as an extra. So that's one piece that's really coming up. And then are cultural activities part of what you're doing? Or are there other amenities and services that you can use to leverage to get your project filled and leased up? Once your project is filled and leased up, you need a wait list. And ideally, you have a wait list that continues to operate, and you'll never have to worry about your vacancies. If you don't have a wait list, you create an issue where the vacancy comes up. You still have the issue of turn and how long it takes to repair and rehab that unit, get it ready back out for release. But you might, if you don't have somebody there, you're taking time without it occupied, and that costs your operating. That affects your operating income, which then in turn affects your operating pro forma and your ability for you to kind of meet your overall operating cost. You have underwritten a certain amount of vacancy when you're underwriting your project. Again, we talked about vacancy underwriting with that development, spreadsheet tool that we've used in the previous training. But that wait list and it really helps you to minimize that vacancy time, which helps you to keep on top of your operating costs. So financial management, using the operating pro forma from your operating budget to track financial management, which I was just saying. You need to make sure you're thinking through, what is your vacancy rate underwritten in your pro forma? If your vacancy rate in effect, if you're a board member, if you're the executive director, if your vacancy rate actually in your first year is turning out to be much lower, or even a bit lower than or higher, meaning you have 8% vacancy, I get higher, a bit different than what you have underwritten. You need to know that, because something is going on site, something what are that, and how is that going to affect your budget in the long term? So something to think through. And then but having flexible grace periods, late fees are huge as we're thinking about the operating pro formas. Are you charging late fees? How is your process for that? Do you promote alternative payment options? Less key, I think now after the pandemic, we have much more property managers who allow for credit card payment, but are there ways for you to pay in multiple fashions, not just checks? And then also, are there methods, particularly the past couple of years, we've had a lot of ways to get emergency rental assistance, so that can help your property manager, can help them get emergency rental assistance, which then pays for your property's losses if there's lack of rental collection. It's also much easier to retain somebody than to move them out and to release an apartment. So if that's the ability, if you have the ability to retain using emergency rental assistance, that's real key. Okay, financial management, developing an annual budget. The annual budget should have been developed prior to creating your financing stack. Making sure within that budget you have adequate operating and emergency reserves, or operating and replacement reserves, and there is a clear accountability for finances. What is your process for collecting rents? If it's by credit card, that can be easier. If it is by, do you allow for rents to be collected that are paid in cash, for example? And if so, how does that get from the property manager and to be posted? And is there somebody else to provide greater accountability for that? Those are the day-to-day property management and financial management tasks. Asset management also often gets locked looked into property management. Asset management is really looking at your portfolio more broadly and looking at the property over the course of its lifetime. And asset management is really more of a task, less of a task for your hired property manager or your property management like team or company, and more of a task of the executive leadership within the owning and operating structure. Meaning, pay attention to long-term needs, think about your housing as a portfolio and as an asset, and making sure that you have places and like something in place to continue to assess that. Which leads us well into maintenance. You should have a comprehensive maintenance plan that should include a work order system to help plan maintenance tasks, adequate maintenance staffing to cover the cost of the routine needs of the property, a vacant unit turnaround policy, and a schedule for periodic site and unit inspections. Vacant unit turnaround policy, what does that mean? It means that how long is your unit vacant before it's expected to be released? So how long does maintenance have to get it turned? That is key. This could be done by a property management company. They might already have all of these tools in place, a work order system. As an owner operator, you need to understand what they have in place and what their standards are, and making sure their standards align with what your standards are in your operating budgets. Okay. And last, but really not least, is we're going to talk a bit about compliance. So there's a lot of ways that you can think about compliance or how compliance is layered into the project. Often your funding source will have basically put in as a lien or as filed as part of the title, land use restriction agreement or a rental use covenant that clarifies that this needs to be affordable for X many years, what your affordability thresholds are, how many of those units, and that should be recorded along with title, along with a deed, and is filed. So that should be aware of all of those when this is when we talk a little bit about site selection or as really initial closings, making sure that everybody knows what those are and what those are recorded, so that if you are going to be, and some documentation of that is actually on site. Because there are a lot of older properties, they were financed 10 years ago, your team is not the same, and it's very possible that your team doesn't understand what your restrictions are and therefore are not even complying with those restrictions. Most of your federal sources are going to require income certification. Depending upon what you have layered in there, they might require yearly or annual income certification. So really understanding what your qualifications are there. Determining how many household members is a key factor for income certification. Is there somebody in and out? Like, what is that? Permanently confined? Like, all of this factors in. It's important because as we talk about in our initial one-on-one sessions, AMI changes based on how many folks you have in a household. This is mostly for LIHTC, important at move-in. And again, because when your low-income housing tax credits expire, your compliance changes a bit at the end of expiration. USDA, home, low-income housing tax credits all have slightly different compliance requirements. I would really encourage you to go to the Nevada, and actually I think, the Nevada Housing Division's website and see what they have in terms of compliance documents. They have a whole bunch of multifamily compliance resources. And so I think I can share my screen to show you that, but I have to get out of this real quick. Yes, so I'll share this real quick. So this is the Nevada Housing Division's landing page for multifamily compliance, and there's a pretty comprehensive manual, and that's on this link here. So you might be able to see like utility allowances, for example, exempt units, the race and ethnic data reporting form, really good resources here. So this is the first place for all of the, for those of you, as you're in Nevada, I think this is the place I would go first as you're really thinking through compliance, particularly if you have state resources, but this is going to give you a broad overview of kind of all of those like federal resources as well. So that is all that we got through everything. Evelyn, I know we had a couple slides to recap. So if you want me to go back to those?
Yeah, or I can.
Okay.
I think it was really just one of the things we always do is a reminder to fill out our form for how well you think you did and all of that.
Really stretching our muscles here to share so many different screens. But yes, really just saying we'd love feedback on this as we're getting it. Evelyn and I were actually seeing a couple things that we're going to refine just so that we don't create confusion and making sure that are a little bit refined. But this PowerPoint deck will go out to you, an edited version, once I get some of that refined. And then we really would love to see you in person again. So we'll be in Reno and Vegas. Question was asked, is it the same training? Yes, it is the same training. So go to one or the other. Don't go to both unless you really just want to hear us talk about the same thing twice. Probably not. We will have slightly different expert panels, I believe, at each different session. So something to note, and hopefully focused in your region. Really excited about bringing in local experts in to talk with you and getting at some of those questions about things like partners that you could have in development and other capacity, and some good and really learning from some of our funders as well. Also on the screen, you can see both mine and Evelyn's email. If you have any questions for us specifically, or like, I would love to know a little bit more about what you said about that, do not hesitate to reach out to us. Evelyn and I live in our email and are answering emails all the time. So this is probably the quickest way to catch us. But of course, you can always ask Joanna or Christine also, and they'll pass questions that you have along as well. So any final questions, put those in the chat. I really appreciate the thanks. And that's this session. We've gotten through both financing and construction, design and stewardship. So really got you through a lot of the phases, and looking forward to wrap up with you in person.
Thanks everyone. Awesome information. Yes. Thank you so much to Evelyn and Robin as well. I'm really looking forward to these in-person sessions. So I know it's a lot of information to take in on Zoom, and it's a really complicated field we're exploring here, but I thank you all for joining us today. I will be sending out the follow-up email with the link to the recording, the surveys, and a lot of the links that we discussed today and were shared in the chat. I'll wrap all those up as well. And I'll just mention again that if you are new to the training series today and you're interested in some of those previous trainings that we've done, the link to the YouTube will be in that email. And if you want more information or the slides or some of the follow-up emails we sent previously, I can send those out to you. Just reply to me and I'll get those to you as well. But again, thanks for joining.